Masterclass for Cities. It's organised by the Real Play Coalition and PlacemakingX. We're a partnership that ran the Real Play City Challenge. In case you don't know us so well, the Real Play Coalition includes IKEA, Lego Foundation, UNICEF, National Geographic, and Arup. PlacemakingX, we're a global network of people changing cities from more than 70 countries around the world. So we've just had a really nice introduction from the Resilient Cities Network and Real Play Coalition in the Cities on the Frontline webinar, where we heard a lot more about Tirana's example of playful cities. And now in this masterclass, we have the chance to dive into more detail about how to enhance impact in playful cities by co-creating with community and placemakers. If we go to the next slide. So there's a glance of some of the people that you're going to see guiding you through the session today. So myself, Hannah Wright from PlacemakingX. You've just heard from Vivian Doompa from PlacemakingX. Charles Landry is going to be presenting for us. And you'll also hear from the winners of the Real Play City Challenge in our breakout sessions a bit later on. So we'll introduce them as we go through the webinar. And if we go to the next slide, the other very important people that we're excited to be here are all of you. So everybody in the masterclass today is someone who is interested and committed to making a difference in playful cities, and we've been quite blown away by the different cities across 20 different countries who have joined us today. So thank you, and we hope this will be a good step in supporting that change. So why we're here today? So we're here because of the challenge statement. Play is an essential right, and it helps children to thrive now and in the future. But many urban environments lack opportunities or a citywide strategy for play. And this is a challenge that we came across with the Real Play Coalition, and we wanted to try and do something about it. If we go to the next slide. So we believe that cities are a resource to make play globally accessible, integrated, and inclusive, and that every city should be able to provide places for children and reclaim and integrate play into the city beyond the playground throughout the city. So there's something that every city can do, we think. And the question is, how can we create that? How can we do that? So we came up with the idea to reclaim play in places for children in cities, and we created the Real Play City Challenge. Now, if I can tell a little bit of my personal story, we were wondering, how do we get more people out there having their efforts acknowledged, and how do we bring more people together? This is my 5th year working in child-friendly urban planning. I started when it was more of a concept, doing some advocating, and I've since been working on the what and how. And I would love for when people refer to my work, it not to be a niche or a specialism, but for it to be common practice and something that everybody can do. And that's something that we came up with on the challenge, which we ran since September last year. So if we go to the next slide, we wanted to inspire action. We wanted to understand what cities, placemakers, urban planners, developers, and any other stakeholders are doing at the moment in cities to work towards playful urban practice. And we wanted to help to promote and scale citywide initiatives and placemaking initiatives to learn from one another, to find out what is working well, what could be done better, and how can we create more of these initiatives in cities around the globe. And we look at 2 different groups. So if we go to the next slide, the first is the citywide approach. This is the system that shapes the strategic long-term vision, multi-year approaches. And these are important because it sets the tone for active participation and inclusion for children in the city. And it also builds capacity in a systemic way to create visible and tangible change in the city. The second group, placemakers. So particularly in times of financial pressure, we need smart investment and high impact initiatives and to have those at scale. So placemaking initiatives are those initiatives which stimulate the community to drive their own initiatives to create impact with limited resources. They use lighter, quicker, cheaper placemaking principles, which means that you can act quickly and temporarily, and you can test what works. And you can do this constant agile assessment and shaping of public space. Now, we want to bring both of these ideas together. So if we go to the next slide, we feel it's important that both the top-down approach, the strategic long-term approach, and the bottom-up approach are harnessed so that cities can really make the most of the energy that's already in their cities and enhance the impact at a strategic level for children and a real impact on the ground in a bottom-up way. So the question is, how do we create those systems that can facilitate both the top-down and the bottom-up change? When I refer to cities and placemakers for the purposes of the masterclass today, we've got a bunch of different people working in cities in the room. So project managers, decision makers, people working in transport, in parks, in planning. And when I talk about placemakers, we're really focusing on those that are external to city governments, external to the organization, and opening up to those. So that can be children, it can be community organizations, childhood professionals, planners, schools, business owners, anybody out there in the community who are creating change in city space and reclaiming play. And we're going to come to a poll now to find out to what level of energy and commitment are you currently co-creating with the community and placemakers. And that means in your work now, and also in the context of a global pandemic, how much is it possible for you to do this at the moment? So if Marta can launch the poll for us, and we'll have a short moment to find out how much energy and commitment people feel they're able to give to co-creating. Just give it a few more moments. I see that 15 of you have voted so far. It's about half of us. Okay, great. And we'll end the poll. We can see the results. Great. So actually, many of us are, actually 4 of us are giving it 100% of our time and energy, which is brilliant. And also the highest ones are 60% or below 40%. So that's one of the challenges that we're going to be looking at today, and how we can enhance our impact by doing this more. And to already introduce some perspectives from the wealth of knowledge in the room, I would love to ask if I can have Maria, who's joining us from Thessaloniki, say something short about the importance of working with and community and placemakers from her experience. If you could unmute yourself, Maria. Share your thoughts.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. So glad to be here among people that we share the same vision, and we're working a lot towards this. I think it's so important to have the multi-level collaboration, as you mentioned, Hannah, like earlier, to have placemakers and the communities and also the city governments on board when we're trying to deliver child-friendly cities, mainly for 2 reasons. The first one would be that when we're talking about a child-friendly city, we're not talking about just an individual project. We're talking about an approach. And in order to have this approach, you need to understand how everyone can contribute to, how may I say this? Like, I'm sorry, I have an issue with my, okay. So in order to have this approach, you need to have everyone on the table to have a common understanding, mainly, because if currently the last few years, the child-friendly city concept has been quite popular and people are more familiar with it. But when we were talking about this like 7 years ago, city governments would be, oh, you're gonna turn this into a playground, and why do we need this? And it's important that everyone understands that when we're talking about child-friendly cities, we're talking about a broader idea that will make the city more accessible and more inclusive to everyone. And we're talking about child-friendly cities. It's not just about the space, like how we're planning the city, but it's also about the services, and it's also about inclusion in decision-making. And this is why we definitely need city authorities to be on board, or at least to understand what we are working towards this, and they can see the buy-in, if I may say this, because they're talking about investments. They can understand how they will get a return when they're investing in such a concept.
Thank you, Maria. That's great. Yeah, so one of the perspectives about why it's so important to bring these 2 different areas together. If we come to the next slide, so essentially by co-creating cities with the community placemakers and city governments, we think that we can build a common understanding, as Maria is saying, throughout all the different services, and we can be a positive force for well-being around the world. And we see this in the winners of the Real Play City Challenge. So the challenge had 10 winning placemakers in cities, which came from 6 different continents. We received proven concepts, tried and tested ideas, integrating both placemaking and citywide strategies. And in the room today, as I said, we have more than 20 countries. So this just adds more dots to the map if we come to the next slide. And we see potential to enhance our impact further with the community of people in the room. There is a lot of good knowledge in this room, and we would really like for you to meet one another, to share your challenges, and to offer your experience to this peer network to kind of bring child-friendly urban practice further. So if I come to the aims of the masterclass today, we want to try and help support some of the changes needed. So first of all, what's important is meeting and learning from one another. We're going to hear some creative ways to make a difference from a city perspective from Charles Landry, who's going to present next. In our breakout sessions, you'll have the opportunity to share and address challenges and to offer your experience. And I'd also like to plant a seed now about shaping the potential next steps of the Real Play City Challenge. We come next on the next slide. So the Real Play City Challenge, it was the first time we ran this, and we ran it in the incredible context of a global pandemic, where bringing the community, children and cities together was quite challenging, especially if you want to change city space on the ground. So there's a lot more that we could do there, and we're interested in hearing your perspectives through the masterclass on what that might be. I'm going to hand back over to Vivian now, and then we'll head over to the challenge.
Thank you, Hannah. So exactly as you have already introduced, it is important, and we've also seen that in the webinars that we were having with the placemakers about how to enhance the impact of a playful city through this co-creation with community and placemakers. So what we have done is that, first of all, we have invited someone who knows a lot about co-creation between the cities and the placemakers, and this is Charles Landry, and I will introduce him in a bit. And what he will also do is to introduce us to what are these stages that we also seem to have identified of a city, of being able to take this next step towards co-creating with the city, with the placemakers and the communities. So in the email that we have sent you, you have already thought about and reflected on your position on the stage that you're currently in having this co-creation. So you have already suggested that some of you are interested in doing that. So 16, and the majority of yours are interested in doing that. Some of you are ready. Some of you have started doing that. Some of you have tried and tested. And we have a question mark because this came as a new insight also for us through the discussion we have had with Charles throughout the previous period about embedding this in your whole process as a city of co-creating together with placemakers. So now, without any further delay, I would like to invite Charles. Charles Landry is, I guess maybe most of you know him, he's the one who invented the term of the creative city. And he has just noted to me some moments ago that he promised that the last time he's going to be using the word creative is for creative bureaucracy. Charles, the floor is yours, and I will stop sharing screen now so that you can also share your slides. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Great, thank you very much. It's lovely to be with all of you. Some of you I know, I wish I knew more of you, but I hope that will happen by the end of this session. Anyway, look, we all know the future is not easy and that there are unbelievable challenges and so on, so I don't need to even elaborate those. And the big issue, as we all know, is when we're in a process of change, how do you do it? And ultimately, how do you embed that change? I mean, here is just one little slide which mentions a couple. When you're bringing forth new agendas like sustainability, feminism, etc., into a culture of an organization, that's one or two examples. The whole notion of placemaking, which is clearly an integrated approach, is also a challenge, bringing that in when we have organizations that basically operate on silos too frequently. And thirdly, another one might be, how do you create agendas that are sort of 360-degree agendas where you're looking at something through everybody's eyes? That's another one of those difficulties. And the child-friendly city, well, I think it's on its way. So perhaps it's not a central dilemma anymore. Now, I'm going to talk about three things. Basically, a tiny background of what the hell is this creative bureaucracy about, just a few examples that are not to do with child-friendly cities, and then to focus on those 5 stages that Vivian outlined before. But just some of the background to the creative bureaucracy was, you know, the decline of the common good, you know, there's bureaucracies are crap and rubbish. We all know the rise of wicked complex problems. Well, I think we all realize that the market on its own can't provide the solutions. And I think we all know, and this is what this group is about, city making is a collective endeavor. So how does one move towards this creative bureaucracy? It started writing a book and all of that stuff, you can imagine. And there was a big conference we had, we've done 3 now. And the main missions of it is really to bring across to people this strange word, because of course people will say, what the hell do you mean creative bureaucracy? Bureaucracy are all rubbish. So what it's trying to do through the title is to stimulate creative. Oh, that's so cool. Bureaucracy, that's so uncool. But basically it's trying to get people to think and put this tension together. But essentially what it's trying to do is to say, within that thing called the public administration, not everybody is stupid there. There are allies, there are friends potentially, and so on. And they may have worked in civic organizations themselves before. And let's remember, when the bureaucracy was invented, it was seen as benign. Now, clearly the public administration is not everything, but I think all of you have experience in knowing that you can't do much without involving them in one way or another. Now, so the idea and the argument about the creative bureaucracy, which is obviously to change the system of public administration as a whole, is it's a sort of trumpet call to think afresh, to be able to unleash talent both in the bureaucracy, but also to create completely new agendas in those bureaucratic systems. Now, there are 3 broad aims of the creative bureaucracy when we invented it and in all our conferences and events. It's really saying the public bureaucracy is something that could be seen as a vocation for interesting people, to shift the image of what it could be, but also particularly to attract young people to reshape it. Now, if it's seen as a horrible type of organization, you won't get talented, interesting young people to get involved. So that, to me or us, is important. The 3 sort of pillars are, 1, how do you rethink the regulations and incentives regime for now? Secondly, how do you reshape that inner life? And this is really important of the bureaucracy, so that people within it can give more of themselves and become the best they can be, which means connecting with people like you, for example, and obviously creating new links to business and civic worlds and so on. And lastly, this is obvious, what are the goals? The goals is to address the big issues that really matter, turn urgent things into reality, you know, the circular economy, decarbonizing or whatever, and obviously ultimately to make fairer, more livable cities. If you wanted to have one slogan, what it's about is how do you move from a no because culture to a yes if culture? And I think you're the key people who can do that. Say, look, guys, it's not no because, we've got so much to offer you. And that bureaucracy that responds is obviously the one we want. Now, we all know, and you don't need to read these words, but we know that so many good people work in public administrations for the public good. They've got good intentions. They've made career choices to work in the public domain. But somehow, oh my God, somehow, these structures that they're in, oh my God, and the ideas as they go through the system evaporate, they fade for so many reasons that you all know about. And this is what we hopefully will change. And so what this is about, so often in bureaucratic systems, the rules that exist shape the vision. But what I think we should be about is reframing it so it's the vision shapes the new rules, and that may obviously apply also to child-friendly cities. So I love this Russian piece of artwork. It does mean that we need to rejig a few things quite substantially. And so the critique, we all know what the critique of bureaucracies are, red tape, all that, all too complex, My God, I took a picture of this woman, she allowed me. I am so frustrated. I can't do what I want to do. And obviously silo thinking and so on. And also too many reports are perhaps written. These are just reports from Paris on their environmental policy, just so you get an idea of how that is. So anyway, I think all of this is a wake-up call to all of us in one way or another. And the question is, what can we all bring to this party? And what this requires, as we all know, I took this picture in Taipei, it says it requires courage, all forms of courage, not only moral courage, but a lot of courage. And in our own little thing, our bureaucracy movement, if I can call it that, we, acknowledge heroines and heroes. Some of them you'll recognize. There on the left, for example, is Gabriela Gomez-Mont from Laboratorio para la Ciudad, just as an example. And what we believe, there may be a movement in the making. This was when we were physical a couple of years ago. So these are a couple of inspirations. They're not child-friendly ones, but it just proves that things can change. We were very involved in creating the whole thing about the intercultural city, not the multicultural city, the intercultural one. Not, I acknowledge it or difference, but what do we do together? And the Council of Europe took that up on our behalf, which was great. There are now 140 members of that network, well beyond Europe. And I do think they've really changed the way we think about diversity, integration, and all of those things. Nothing now to do with us, it's all them, those people working there. But that is just one idea of a movement that one can create. Of course, we've got Vivian here, so I must mention Sinafina. No, but everybody knows that that is a social innovation platform that did a hell of a lot of stuff that doesn't really need elaborating. You know all about it. The third example I've always loved is the Bologna one, the Bologna Declaration on the Urban Commons, which is essentially a form of, with citizens in the city, together co-managing, for example, parks and other things. And that has inspired, obviously, quite a lot, the Urban Commons movement. Finally, something from South Australia, where it was legitimized that anyone, a citizen or a bureaucrat, could name a problem that they wanted to be solved in 90 days. A lot more to be said about it. Sometimes it worked very well. It was, as someone said earlier, I think it was Hans, light, easy, cheap. Others were more complicated, but nevertheless, having a deadline is often very good to establish transformative change. So back now to you and you, playful cities and this bureaucracy thing. What could you do in those 5 stages? Let's call it the 5 moments that we discussed and we're going to discuss a bit later. And here are just some guidelines. This is me talking, yeah. I mean, you'll have your own ideas, of course. So firstly, I think one context and precondition of all of that is that we have to see the world through the eyes also of the bureaucrat. We have to understand their conditions. We have to understand their realities, their pressures and their constraints, because often they're behaving in ways that as a private individual, they might not want to. So just simply understanding where they're at is incredibly important. But at the flip side also, there are opportunities. And I've just put the word timing there. Quite often, and you will know that, it's November the 29th, and there's a little budget left over. Okay, grab that budget quickly, but also know that the budget better be below 20,000, for example, because when it's 21,000, we have to go out for tender, whereas you have liberty to give any money below 20,000. That's just an example. So understand where they're at and where they're coming from. Now let's take the first one, and these are just little snapshots. And please, as I'm speaking, it's really questions for you to agree, disagree with, or whatever. So for me, I'm interested in this stuff. So somehow I've got to define why it's important, why it's urgent. I've got to find a way of outlining the issue, the problem, what the dilemma is. Perhaps children are unhappy, trapped in their apartments. We then, of course, have to find allies. And then the examples, which is why your challenge is so great. We've got examples here. We've got bloody, I don't know how many, 50, 100, but we've got prize winners and so on. And also, I've always found that when you're raising an issue, when you then suggest to the public administrator that actually it's solving a problem that you actually wanted to solve, but you couldn't really express, but I'm giving you an expression of it. Youth disorder, let's call it that. This will perhaps solve that thing that you've been tackling with. Graffiti, we love some graffiti, we hate other graffiti. So just an old example of I'm interested, and then what defined the urgency was obviously the way a long time ago through the Club of Rome, the sustainability agenda was put on the map. Okay, I'm ready. My God, I'm ready. I've gone through all that horrible work. And I'm then going to identify expertise. And that's where, you know, my helpers, the helpers, our helpers, placemaking, you understand suddenly, hey, there are people out there who've thought about this. They've got solutions. They know pathways to get through the problem. And then most clearly is to find that champion within the administration itself. And that somehow also might be tied to generating something that is credible, that you've done already from the I'm interested phase. And it might be a report, hopefully a very visually attractive report with not so many words in it as mine here. Anyway, and then identifying an opportunity. Now, classically, and I'm just using a very big opportunity, are things like the European Capital of Culture, but it could be something else. It could be the Real Play Challenge. It could be anything at a smaller scale. And within that, because within the European Capital of Culture mechanisms, there's always space to try things out. That's what they're about in part. And within that, you define a project. You call it a pilot project. You say, oh, it's only now, you know, if it's rubbish, we can drop it later. But ideally conceive of it as catalytic, that it's scalable and so on. Now we're into this phase. I've started. Oh my God, I've started. Right, the first thing when you've started is to make sure that you've got those champions, to make sure that at least more than one person ideally is on board, because it's really quite important over time to get a broader spread. My experience, for example, with bringing arts practice into bureaucracies historically has always been, okay, we're in the arts department. Hey, but hey, what's your benefit for economic development? What's your benefit for mental health and social services? How can I help healthcare and so on? So beginning to spread it out through the departmental nexus. And then, of course, getting the outsiders inspired and involved. That may be a private business, it may be civic activists, it may be all the list that Hannah mentioned earlier. And what I find quite important, and although I don't personally like doing this anymore, is preparing the evaluation sort of as you're conceiving the project, because you know there's going to be some difficult person somewhere who says to you, well, what's the value of all this? Now, in the long run, when we're embedding, we don't say, what's the value of this? We say, what's the value of not thinking about this? But that's stage 5. Now we've tried and tested, as many of you have, and that is then showing actually the evidence that it's solving these many problems that we're talking about. It's a multifaceted approach. It's an approach that needs to embed itself throughout the nervous system, because you're saying, hey, it's helping all of you in some way. And this is the time also, obviously at some point before you've tried to get this little budget, but this is where you try, I believe, to try to get these joint commitments and multiple budgets from different sources. And that's partly for your own resilience possibilities, because if one of them drops out, at least you can go on. So just having one funder is, you know, okay, if they're God and goddess-like, but in the end, you know, I think it's better to have multiple ones. And then, which was mentioned in the session before, in the one an hour ago, is how playfulness actually is good for all of us. I mean, I wish it was more playful. I wish I could play. Oh, let me play with you, for example. But anyway, of course, the young are the future ambassadors of all of this. And then finally, I've embedded it. It's sort of part of my story. And that's when one sort of does the nitty-gritty work to do that the word is embodied in all policies, you know, just like going back to culture, that if you've got an economic policy, somehow the word culture is in it. If you've got a health policy, it's in there somehow. So in any policy, just ensuring and doing that nitty gritty work and, you know, paying attention that it's not forgotten. And then, of course, we hope that this approach has provided bureaucrats with the knowledge that collaboration is a win-win situation. We can do more often with less of our involvement. And we used to run a prize myself in my organization, which was for bureaucrats, for public institutions and cities to exchange power for creative influence. And what we meant by that is that institutions give away power to others, they share it, but they're part of a bigger win, a bigger story. And for me, that was quite significant. And there are a number of cities who were able to do that. And then we've got these classic decisions that happened with sustainability, women's issues, and so on. It's a decision. Do you have the child-friendly city office? Okay, perhaps transitionally, yes. And or a task force? Or do you hope then it's just so normalized that it's everywhere? So I think that's all I'll say, and I'll see a couple of you later. And that's the end, my friend.